They said he was a monster, a towering brute who lived alone atop Black Hollow Ridge, shrouded in grief and silence. No one dared approach the cabin with the crooked chimney, where whispers claimed he buried his past with his bare hands. Women in town crossed themselves at the mention of his name, and yet, when one cast-out young woman stumbled into his world, she found not violence, but a gentleness no one believed could exist. Why did the mountain man hide from the world? And how did her presence begin to heal a heart everyone thought was broken forever? When a girl with nowhere to go met the man everyone feared, something changed in the valley, not just for them, but for the town that once turned its back. What does it take to see the truth behind a legend, and who decides who is worthy of love? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories like this still speak to us, no matter where we're from. If you believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the healing power of kindness, you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Snow fell in thick, silencing sheets as Clara stumbled past the edge of town. Her threadbare shawl clutched tight around her shoulders. Each breath came out in a cloud, white and ragged, as if the cold were trying to take her last bit of warmth. Behind her, the crooked roofs of Millstone Hollow blurred into the white haze, and with them, every door that had slammed shut when she'd pleaded for help. They all knew what Harlan Voss had done, and still no one had stepped forward. No one ever did. Clara didn't cry, not because she wasn't scared, but because she had learned long ago that tears never changed a man's mind, especially not a man like Harlan. Her mother had died with that lesson on her bruised lips. Now, Clara carried it like a stone in her chest, heavy and unmoving. She was 16 when the whisper started, 17 when Harlan drank too much and made it clear she'd be more valuable married off than left as a burden, 18 when he finally struck the deal to sell her hand to a man 3 times her age in exchange for wiping away his gambling debts. She'd run that night before the ink dried. Each step through the snow felt heavier than the last, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The old man Harlan promised her would come for her by morning. He had a legal claim, Harlan said, like she was land or a mule. Clara had no family left to fight for her, and no one in Millstone Hollow cared enough to question what a girl was worth. She brought it on herself, they'd said. Too pretty for her own good. Too wild since her mama died. Ruined. She heard the words in her mind as clearly as if they were being said now, carried on the wind like broken glass. Her boots, already worn through at the sole, soaked through quickly. The cold bit at her ankles. Her fingers, red and stiff, clutched her most precious belongings, a cloth-wrapped sketchbook, smudged and dog-eared, and a small satchel of bread and dried apples she'd stolen from Harlan's pantry. The food wouldn't last more than a day, maybe 2, but she didn't care. She'd rather starve in the mountains than be claimed like property. The forest rose up around her, dark, immense, ancient. The snow muted everything. No birdsong, no wind, just the soft crunch of her own footsteps and the rhythmic pound of her heartbeat in her ears. Her breath quickened. She wasn't prepared for the wilderness. She had no map, no weapons, no plan. But she'd heard the stories that somewhere beyond the ridge, deep in the folds of the valley, lived a man no one dared visit. A recluse. A beast, they said, a killer. But Clara knew something about the cruelty of men, and she'd rather risk a monster in the woods than the devil she already knew. By dusk, her limbs felt like stone. Her stomach ached from hunger. She'd wandered off the game trail without realizing, and now the land sloped sharply downward. She lost her footing on a patch of hidden ice and fell hard, her sketchbook flying from her grasp and disappearing into the snow. She lay there a moment, too tired to move, the snow soaking through her dress. The sky was turning purple, night folding in fast. She dragged herself upright, head spinning, and picked a direction. Any direction. In the distance, the trees thickened into shadows. Somewhere out there, something moved. She was not alone, but neither was she going back. The snow thickened as Clara pushed deeper into the wilderness, the trees growing taller, darker, and closer together. With each hour, the light faded and the warmth leached from her limbs until her hands could barely grip the frayed strap of her satchel. Her breath was shallow now, her cheeks raw from wind and cold. Still, she didn't stop. To stop would be to surrender, and there was no one left to surrender to. She followed a narrow deer path until it disappeared beneath a blanket of snow. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the crunch of her boots and the occasional creak of snow-laden branches overhead. The world had become a frozen hush, the air so still it felt sacred. Or cursed. Clara didn't know the difference anymore. Her foot suddenly punched through what she thought was solid ground. With a yelp, she fell forward, arms flailing, and plunged knee-deep into icy water. A half-frozen stream hidden beneath a thin crust of snow and ice dragged at her legs. Panic surged. The cold was searing like knives against her skin, and she thrashed, trying to free herself. The current was slow but persistent, and the banks slippery with packed ice. It took everything she had to scramble free, crawling up the far side on hands and knees, gasping, soaked through, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She lay there for several minutes, shaking violently, unable to move. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, melted on her lips. The stream gurgled behind her, indifferent. Her dress was sodden and heavy, her boots sloshing with every step as she forced herself back up. She had to keep going. She didn't know how far the ridge was, but she knew she wouldn't survive a night exposed out here, soaked and still. Hours passed. The cold became a dull hum beneath her skin, her body too tired to shiver. Her thoughts slowed, spiraling inward. Harlan's voice echoed from some dark corner of her memory. No man wants what's already broken. She'd believed that once. Maybe she still did. But even the broken deserved to live free. A branch snapped somewhere to her right. Clara froze, breath held, eyes wide. The forest was still again. Then, another sound. A shift of weight. Something large. Her heart kicked hard in her chest. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the trees. A shadow stood between two pines, tall, wide, unmoving. Not bear, not elk, bigger, human-shaped, but massive. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, and then it was gone. She backed away, without taking her eyes from the spot where it had stood, nearly tripping over a root. Her legs were shaking again. With fear now as much as cold, she couldn't outrun anything in her state. But nothing chased her. As night fell, Clara stumbled into a shallow cave half hidden beneath a rocky overhang, just deep enough to shield her from the wind. She crawled inside and pulled her soaked shawl tight around her shoulders, curling in on herself. Her fingers were too stiff to start a fire. All she could do was lie there, trembling, her sketchbook pressed to her chest, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Somewhere not far from the cave, branches rustled, snow shifted, and someone, watched from the edge of the trees, unseen by Clara's dimming eyes. She slept without knowing she wasn't alone. The cold had settled into Clara's bones like iron. She drifted in and out of a shallow, aching sleep, her body curled tightly on the cave floor, trying to hold what little warmth remained. At some point during the night, she had managed to spark a tiny fire from damp twigs with the last of her matches, but now it was nothing but a smudge of ash. Her shawl, stiff with frost, offered little protection. She could no longer feel her toes. A sound stirred her awake. a low grunt, like the throat clearing of a man unused to speaking. Clara's eyes fluttered open. The faint gray light of dawn filtered into the mouth of the cave, and there, half-shadowed, stood a figure. Her breath caught in her throat. He filled the entrance, not just tall, but massive, his shoulders stretching near to the stone on either side. Snow clung to his boots, and a heavy wool coat hung from his frame like it had been stitched by hand, patched and worn. His beard was thick, shot with gray in his face. His face bore the kind of scars that told no clear story, only that they had been earned in pain. One eye was a little narrower than the other, as if it had been struck once, long ago, and yet he stood utterly still, like the mountain itself had stepped forward. Clara didn't speak. Couldn't. Her throat was dry. She tried to push herself upright, but her limbs protested. Her arms shook beneath her, and she barely rose an inch before slumping back down. The man didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. His boots made no sound, though they were heavy. In his hands was a thick wool blanket, far warmer than the pitiful one wrapped around her. He knelt beside her, carefully, his movements deliberate and strangely gentle for someone so imposing. Clara flinched, expecting pain, expecting rough hands. She braced for it, but it never came. Instead, he draped the blanket over her shoulders, tucking it in around her, as though she were a sleeping child. He didn't touch her skin. He didn't speak. When she looked up into his face, expecting to find lust or cruelty, she found only distance. Like he wasn't even seeing her. Not really. His eyes scanned the fire pit, the abandoned matchbox, the sad satchel of spoiled food. Then, without a word, he stood and walked back toward the cave mouth. "Wait!" Clara rasped, but her voice came out hoarse and thin. He didn't stop. He stepped back into the light and disappeared from view. She tried to follow, dragging herself toward the entrance, but her body gave out again. She collapsed against the stone floor, heart racing with confusion and fear. Who was he? Why hadn't he taken anything? Why had he helped? She curled beneath the blanket, thick and smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine, and stared toward the cave mouth, too weak to move, too stunned to make sense of what had just happened. She didn't know his name, but the townspeople had whispered of him, the mountain man, the widower, the beast, Gideon, the giant. When Clara opened her eyes again, light streamed through the cave mouth in muted gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle, frozen world. Her limbs ached, her lips cracked, but the blanket wrapped tightly around her still held warmth. She had not dreamed the giant. He had been real. The sound of boots crunching in the snow stirred her. She sat up with effort, just as he appeared again, the mountain of a man, with his eyes lowered and arms full, a tin pail of water in one hand, a wrapped bundle of cloth in the other. Without a word, he knelt and placed the food down beside her. Coarse bread, salted pork, and something sweet. Dried berries, maybe, softened with snowmelt. Clara stared. She should have asked his name, demanded to know who he was, what he wanted, but her throat was still raw, and there was something in his quiet movements that made her pause. He did not look at her as he worked, did not expect gratitude. He simply unwrapped the food, pushed it gently toward her, and stepped back. She ate slowly, careful not to make herself sick, every bite filling the hollow space in her belly like a promise that she might make it another day. He watched her only once, briefly to ensure she wasn't choking, then turned his gaze to the cave wall. The silence between them stretched, thick but not cruel, just present. When she finished, he gestured toward the mouth of the cave, then turned and began to walk. Clara hesitated. Follow him? Into the woods? Toward what? Safety or danger? But she was too weak to survive another night alone, and the cave, now that the cold had settled back in, no longer felt like refuge. She gathered the blanket, her sketchbook, her satchel, and followed. The path was steep, winding through thick pine and drifts of snow that came up to her knees. He walked ahead, not slowing, but not leaving her behind either. Once, when she slipped, he turned and offered a hand. His skin was rough, his palm massive, but he helped her up without a word, then released her as soon as she was steady. By the time they reached the cabin, her legs were trembling again. It sat low on a rise between two ridges, built of rough-hewn logs and smoke-blackened stone, the roof sagging slightly at one end. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. The chimney puffed faint curls of smoke, and the door creaked open without protest. Inside was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the space itself. Functional, tidy, and oddly careful. Everything had a place. There were handmade shelves stacked with dried herbs and canned goods, a cot against the wall with a hand-quilted blanket, a table scarred with use. The air smelled of cedar and old smoke. He didn't speak, just pointed to the cot, then to a jug of water and a clean towel. Clara nodded slowly, unable to find her voice. When night came, she waited for him to take the cot, but he only retrieved a heavy coat from a hook, nodded once to her, not kindly, not coldly, just simply, and stepped outside. She heard the faint squeak of snow under his boots, then silence. He slept under the stars. She slept in his home. And for the first time in weeks, Clara felt safe, not because she understood him, but because she sensed that he carried something inside him even heavier than silence. Pain, perhaps, or penance. The days blurred together, softened by snow and silence. Clara did not ask Gideon to speak, and he offered no words beyond the occasional grunt or gesture. Yet in his silence, something began to form, not comfort, not yet, but a rhythm, a fragile understanding. He rose early each morning, stepping quietly over the creaking floorboards, lighting the stove before dawn. When Clara stirred, the scent of wood smoke and boiling oats already filled the cabin. He never said good morning, but the bowl left at her place was warm and the portion always generous. She began to move through the space more freely, unsure at first, cautious not to disturb what seemed like a carefully balanced solitude. The cabin, though clean, had the cluttered signs of long isolation. Tools left where they fell, shelves stacked with half-finished repairs. Clara, grateful to feel useful, began to tidy. She swept the stone floor, sorted the dried herbs hanging in brittle bunches above the hearth, and wiped down surfaces layered with the dust of forgotten seasons. Gideon didn't stop her, nor did he help, not with cleaning at least, but one morning she found a new broom leaning against the wall where her old one had splintered. They did not speak of it. When a storm rolled in, burying the ridge in drifts taller than the window ledges, they were snowbound for 3 days. Time slowed. Gideon busied himself mending a roof beam that had bowed under years of snowfall. Clara sat nearby, her feet tucked under her skirt, watching from the corner of her eye. His movements were steady, efficient, strong. The beam groaned as he set it back into place, but he said nothing of the effort, just wiped the sweat from his brow and turned back to the fire, his eyes unreadable beneath the weight of his brow. Clara found herself sketching again, not just to pass the time, but to make sense of the silence. She drew the curl of smoke from the chimney, the crooked trees outside the cabin, the small red fox that darted across the snow one afternoon. Her lines were shaky at first, but her hand remembered what her heart had nearly forgotten. On the third night, as the wind howled and the fire snapped low, she closed her sketchbook and turned to find something resting on the table beside her satchel. A bundle of parchment tied with twine. not the rough kind he used for kindling. This was finer, thick, soft, perfect for drawing. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't asked. She hadn't needed to. He had noticed. She looked toward him. He sat near the fire, whittling something in his lap, his eyes cast down. He didn't look up. He never did when he did something kind. Clara pressed the parchment to her chest. In that small, wordless gesture, she saw more than manners or politeness. She saw a man paying attention in his own quiet way. A man who understood the comfort of being seen without being spoken to. She began to draw him then, not directly, not his face, just his hands, thick with callus, careful in their labor, his back broad and quiet as a tree. The way he stood by the window at dusk, always watching the woods like something might come through the trees if he turned away too long. He had been alone for so long that even kindness had become quiet. But Clara had lived long enough with men who used their words like weapons to know this silence was different. It wasn't hiding harm. It was hiding hurt. The storm passed with the quiet dignity of things that had seen too much. Outside, the snow lay thick and undisturbed. A white shroud pulled over the forest's wounds. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, its glow chasing shadows into corners. Clara swept near the back wall, gathering bits of bark and ash that had crept in under boots. Her fingers were red from cold, her shoulders sore, but her mind drifted peacefully until the broom struck something solid beneath the floorboards. Not stone, not wood. A dull thunk. She crouched and brushed aside the rug. There, beneath a warped plank, was a chest, iron-bound, locked. It was old, worn smooth by time, and the press of boots walking over it forgotten or hidden. She didn't pry, just ran her fingers along the edge, curious. She replaced the rug and said nothing. That evening, Gideon sat near the fire as he always did, his massive frame hunched slightly, a mug of something dark resting untouched in his hands. The silence was thicker than usual, but not heavy. Clara sat nearby, sketching by firelight. A rabbit this time, or something like it, curled in on itself for warmth. She didn't ask questions. She never had to. He spoke when he wanted to, and tonight, after what felt like an entire hour of silence, he did. "I built this place for them," he said, voice low, like it wasn't meant to carry. Clara looked up, pencil still in hand. "My wife, Mabel, and our daughter, Elsie. She was just 5. He stared into the flames as though they still held pieces of what he'd lost. Clara didn't interrupt. She didn't move. "I'd gone into town for supplies. Storm had come through a few nights before and the chimney was cracked. I meant to fix it when I got back. Meant to..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I was a day too late." The fire popped, and he flinched slightly. He didn't look at Clara. His hands gripped the mug tightly. "They said I was drunk in town. Said I left them alone too long. That I didn't mourn right. That maybe I lit the fire myself." His jaw tightened. When a man already lives apart, folks don't need much reason to blame him for what they can't understand. Clara's breath hitched, but she made no sound. "I buried them myself, right near that pine at the edge of the ridge. Then I came up here. Haven't been down since." The silence that followed was different than before, not empty. Full of things too hard to say and too sacred to demand answers for. Clara folded her sketchbook closed and looked at him. Really looked, not with fear, not with pity, but with the quiet, steady gaze of someone who had also been blamed, cast aside, called names she didn't deserve. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice soft as the snow outside. Gideon didn't respond, but something in his shoulders eased, just barely. "Enough." And for the first time, the silence between them felt like a shared blanket rather than a wall. The days grew longer as the sun began to linger in the sky, melting the thick snowpack inch by inch. Icicles clung stubbornly to the cabin eaves, dripping slowly as if even the forest itself were learning to let go. Inside, warmth settled not just in the hearth, but in the quiet rhythm of two people slowly remembering how to live alongside another soul. Gideon wasn't a man of books, not anymore. But one morning, as Clara was quietly reading aloud from a weathered volume she'd found on the cabin shelf, a collection of parables and frontier tales, she noticed his eyes tracking the words, not drifting as they usually did. She paused, gently pointed to a line, and without asking, began to teach. Just a little at a time. Letters, sounds, patience. At first he grumbled, resistant, like the act of remembering pained him. But she saw through it, and when he finally sounded out a full sentence, slow and gravel-voiced, yet clear, she smiled so brightly that Gideon looked away, ears faintly red. He repaid her in his own way. One morning, he nudged her awake before dawn and handed her a pair of his old boots, stuffed with wool and crudely stitched down to her size. Then, without explanation, he led her into the woods. The snow was thinning, crusted with ice in places, and the ground beneath was beginning to thaw. He showed her how to spot broken branches, faint hoof prints, tufts of fur caught on bark. He walked with a kind of reverence, not through the forest, but with it. Clara followed close behind, matching his stride, watching him crouch, point, and nod. That was the morning they found the fawn. It lay tangled in bramble, its leg bloodied and bent at an angle no creature could walk on. Clara rushed forward instinctively, but Gideon raised a hand, stilling her. He knelt first, murmured something low that she couldn't hear, then gently freed the creature's leg from the snare of thorns. The fawn was breathing hard, too weak to fight. Its eyes were wild, frightened. Together, they carried it back, Gideon holding the bulk, Clara wrapping its trembling legs. For days, they nursed it by the hearth. Clara tended its wounds, changed its wrappings. Gideon carved a small cradle of branches to keep it from shifting too much. He spoke little, but Clara saw the way his hands hovered, cautious, every movement mindful. As the fawn grew stronger, so did they. Clara laughed one evening when the animal tried to stand and promptly collapsed into a pile of firewood. Gideon, startled, let out a short, rough sound, something close to a chuckle. Clara turned to him, wide-eyed. "Was that a laugh?" she teased. He grunted, but his mouth twitched at the corners. By the end of the week, the fawn stood on its own. By the next, it followed them outside. In that small creature, fragile, wounded, recovering, Clara saw something familiar. And when she caught Gideon watching it graze by the edge of the woods, eyes soft in a way she'd never seen before, she knew he saw it too. They hadn't spoken the words. They didn't need to. In every shared task, every small gesture, every evening they passed in companionable silence, something had begun to form between them, not romance, not yet. Something deeper, a sense of home that had nothing to do with the walls around them and everything to do with the people inside. In the town of Millstone Hollow, where truth bent easily under the weight of a whisper, it did not take long for the stories to begin. Clara had been gone for weeks, and that absence left a void ready to be filled by men like Harland Voss, men who knew how to twist silence into scandal. She was taken, he told the barber, the blacksmith, the postmaster's wife, snatched by that brute who lives up in the ridge. You know the one, Gideon, that monster. He said it with just enough grief in his eyes to be convincing, just enough righteous outrage to fan the flame. She's barely a woman, he added, lowering his voice, and he's twice her age. She's probably being kept like some sort of mountain bride. The townfolk clucked their tongues, wrung their hands. Harlan didn't mention the deal he'd tried to strike, the man he'd tried to sell Clara to like a sack of potatoes. He didn't mention the bruises she'd left behind when she fled, or the way she'd cried not to be married off. Those truths were inconvenient. And besides, no one questioned a man when he wrapped his cruelty in concern. But it wasn't just his reputation he was trying to save. Harlan had other motives, and one of them arrived on the noon train 2 days after the rumors took hold. A man in a sharp coat and polished boots stepped off the last car, his eyes scanning the dirt road with a kind of practiced impatience. He introduced himself at the saloon as Mr. Eli Granger, a representative of the Midline Railway expansion. "I'm here looking for land," he told Harlan over whiskey that evening. "High land. Stable, remote. We'll pay well for ridge properties, especially those with lumber access. But deeds must be clean. No contested titles. No squatters." Harlan leaned back in his chair, smiling just enough. "Well now," he said, swirling the glass, "there's a place. Just such a spot. Hard to get to, sure, but the man who's living on it don't own it outright. Not legally, anyway." Granger raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Name's Gideon Bell. Used to live here. Wife and child died in a fire. He ran after that. Some say he set the blaze himself. Never came back to face it. Folks let him stay out of pity, but truth is, he's a trespasser. No claim to the land." Granger nodded, fingers tapping thoughtfully on the bar. "If he's a criminal," he said, "and the land's abandoned, we can move fast." Harlan smiled wider. "Exactly what I was thinking." Outside the saloon, the wind kicked dust along the wooden boards of the street. In the still air, the lies took root quick and deep. By the end of the week, the story had grown. The beast in the hills had taken the girl, and the town, ever eager for a villain it could safely despise, began to believe it without question. All Harlan needed was a sheriff's letter and a railroad seal. If Gideon was labeled a danger, the land would be forfeit, and Harlan, ever the gambler, was betting on the town's appetite for scandal to do the rest. After all, who would believe the girl? And who would defend a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in over a decade? The trap was being laid, silent and legal, beneath their feet. The morning sun filtered through the trees like pale gold, catching on the last remnants of frost that clung to the needles and branches. Clara had just finished sweeping the porch, her cheeks flushed with cold, when she heard the crunch of boots. Not one pair, but several. Too many. She looked up and froze. 3 men on horseback were making their way down the narrow path toward the cabin, their coats thick with trail dust, rifles slung across their saddles. One wore a deputy's badge pinned crooked on his chest. The others bore the stiff posture of men who weren't used to being questioned. Behind them trailed a 4th horse, its saddle empty. Clara backed slowly into the cabin, her heart thudding in her throat. "Gideon?" she called, voice tight. He stepped from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. One look at her face, and he was at the door. The horses stopped just shy of the woodpile. The man with the badge dismounted with a practiced ease, his eyes sweeping the cabin, then settling on Clara, who hovered just behind Gideon's shoulder. "You Gideon Bell?" the deputy asked, voice too casual for the weight he carried. Gideon said nothing. "We're here on legal business," the deputy went on, unrolling a crumpled sheet of paper. "This girl, Clara Voss, is listed as a runaway ward of her stepfather, Harlan Voss. He's filed a complaint of unlawful detainment. Says you've taken her against her will. We're here to bring her back." Clara's stomach dropped. The paper might as well have been blank for all the truth it held. "She's not property," Gideon said at last, his voice low and steady. "She came here of her own choosing. I didn't take her. I sheltered her." The other 2 men shifted, hands twitching near their weapons. "She's underage," the deputy replied, "and legally under Harlan's guardianship. You're interfering with that. Now, we don't want trouble. Just hand her over and we'll be on our way." Gideon didn't move. "She's not going anywhere." The silence that followed was tense and brittle. Clara felt the cold seep deeper into her bones, but she stood straighter. Her fingers clutched the edge of Gideon's coat, but her voice, when it came, didn't shake. "I'm not going back," she said. "Harlan sold me to a man twice my age to pay his debts. I ran. I ran to save my life." The deputy's jaw tightened. "That may be, but that's not what this paper says." "I don't care what that paper says," Gideon growled, stepping forward. "You've got no right to drag her back to what she escaped from. If you try, you'll be the ones breaking the law." The man mounted his horse again, eyes narrow. "You're making a mistake, old man. Harboring a ward, interfering with a legal claim. These are charges that'll stick. You think this cabin's safe? Think again." He yanked the reins. "You'll regret this." The four horses turned, kicking up snow and dirt as they retreated back through the trees. Clara stood frozen as the sound of hooves faded into silence. Gideon turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "They'll come back," she whispered. He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The wind had shifted. Clara felt it in the stillness between words, in the way Gideon stood longer at the window now, watching the path as if expecting the snow to carry men with guns back to his doorstep. There was no peace in the cabin anymore, only waiting, measured in each breath they held when the wind creaked the door, in each silence that lingered too long over supper. They both knew the law had not left for good. One afternoon, while Gideon was out splitting wood, Clara swept the cabin floor, her motions slow. Distracted, her thoughts drifted to the men, to Harlan's lies, to the crooked badge and the cold threat in the deputy's voice. She paused near the hearth, leaning on the broom. Her gaze landed on the rug in the corner, the one she had nearly tripped over more times than she could count. Something about it itched at her thoughts. She nudged it aside with her foot. The floorboards beneath were uneven, and one had a faint groove worn into the edge, as if fingers had pried it loose before. She knelt. Carefully, she worked her fingers into the gap and lifted the board. Beneath, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a bundle the size of a book. She unwrapped it slowly, her hands trembling with something she couldn't name. Inside was a letter, yellowed with time, the ink faded but still legible. It was addressed to Gideon, written in a woman's hand and signed Mabel. Clara read it once, then again. The words struck like a bell tolling in her bones. "Gideon, if something happens to me, if they twist it like I know they will, promise me you won't believe what they say. The chimney's worse than we thought. I know it's dangerous, but you were right. We didn't have the coin to fix it before winter, and now they've come again. Eli Granger and his men said they'd make you disappear if you wouldn't sell. Said no one would miss us up here. I told them no. You'd never forgive me if I gave in, but I think they meant it. If anything happens, you fight for the truth, not for me, but for Elsie." Mabel. Clara sat there on the cold floor for a long time, her breath shallow, the letter shaking in her hands. When Gideon stepped back into the cabin and brushing snow from his shoulders, she stood and met him with eyes full of quiet fire. She didn't speak right away, she just held the letter out to him. He took it with a puzzled frown, his fingers fumbling slightly as he unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the words, and for a moment he said nothing. But then she saw it. The faint tremble in his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell like someone finally surfacing after being underwater for years. I didn't know she wrote this," he murmured. I thought they just lied because it was easy. But this, it's more than a letter," Clara said softly. "It's proof of what really happened, of what Harlan's trying to do now. We can use it." Gideon looked up, the firelight catching in the lines of his face, softening something hardened there for far too long. "You think they'll listen?" Clara nodded. They'll have to. The truth had been buried beneath their feet all along. And now it was no longer just a memory, it was a weapon. The road into town was cold and long, but Clara walked it without fear. The letter from Mabel was folded safely inside her coat, close to her heart, and with each step, she felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a kind of anchor. The sky above Millstone Hollow was clouded and gray, and the trees that lined the path stood like quiet witnesses to her journey. She did not look back. She could not afford to. She wore Gideon's old coat, heavy on her shoulders, the sleeves rolled at the wrists. Snow clung to the hem of her skirt, and her boots, too large, left a wide trail behind her. Some of the townspeople watched her pass from behind curtains, others from porches, arms folded tight. She met no one's eyes, not until she reached the narrow house on the edge of town with herbs hanging by the door and steam rising from the chimney. Clara knocked twice. Midwife Ruth answered, apron dusted with flour, her graying hair tied back with a strip of faded calico, her lined face lit with something like surprise, then concern. "Child," Ruth said, stepping aside without waiting for explanation, "get in here before you freeze to death." Inside, the warmth hit Clara like a wave. The smell of baking bread and dried lavender filled the small home. Ruth pressed a mug of tea into her hands, then waited, sensing something deeper than a visit was at hand. "I need you to listen," Clara said, voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "And I need you to believe me." "I always believed you," Ruth replied. "Now tell me what you've got." Clara unfolded the letter carefully and set it on the table between them. Ruth leaned forward, eyes scanning the page. As she read, her expression changed from curiosity to grief, and then to anger, quiet and sharp. "I remember when Mabel came to me," Ruth said, her voice soft. "Told me about the chimney. Told me the landmen were sniffing around. I never knew it went this far. She tried to warn him," Clara whispered, "but they buried it. And now Harlan's trying to finish what they started." Ruth nodded slowly. "He's brought in a judge. Due in 2 days' time. The whole town's been stirred up with talk of Gideon being dangerous, Clara. Folks are afraid. And when they're afraid, they believe the loudest voice in the room." "Then we need to be louder," Clara said. The old midwife smiled faintly. "You've got Mabel's fire and Gideon's stubbornness." She stood, smoothing her apron. "I'll gather the others. The ones who remember who Gideon really was before all this. The preacher, the miller's widow, even old Brant at the general store. It won't be easy, but you brought truth into the light, and some folks still know what to do with that." Ruth walked her to the door, her eyes shining with quiet resolve. "Tell Gideon to be ready. The judge may be coming for him, but he won't be standing alone when he gets here." Clara nodded and stepped back into the cold, the wind biting at her cheeks, but something inside her had changed. The girl who had fled into the woods had been running from pain. The woman walking back now was running toward justice. The storm didn't break with thunder or rain. It came on feet, in fine coats and polished boots, in sharp paper and false smiles. It came as Harlan Voss, flanked by 2 railroad men and the town's deputy, striding into Millstone Hollow like he already owned it. And in his hand, clutched like a trophy, was a folded set of legal documents that he waved high in front of the general store crowd. "Guardianship," he declared, "and deed forfeiture. This land squatter's days are numbered, and the girl's coming home." Word spread fast. By sundown, everyone in town knew a judge would arrive in the morning to officiate the transfer. Gideon's cabin would be seized. Clara would be taken. And the ridge, wild and untamed and sacred, would be carved into for rail and coin. But word travels in more than one direction. Ruth moved like wildfire, quiet and purposeful, She visited homes, one by one, speaking not just to the women, but to the old men who remembered Gideon as a boy, the preacher who'd baptized his daughter, the shopkeeper who still carried a scar on his hand from when Gideon saved him during the flood. Of 71, she brought them Mabel's letter, she brought them Clara's voice, and she brought them a choice. By nightfall, the old wooden church atop the hill was filled with uneasy townsfolk, packed into the pews with their coats still on and their questions unspoken. The rafters groaned softly in the wind. Candles flickered along the altar. Ruth stood near the pulpit, hands folded, waiting. Harlan was the first to speak. He didn't wait to be asked. She's a runaway, nothing more, and that man's a criminal hiding in the hills with someone else's property. The law is on its way. You all ought to be thinking about progress, not ghosts. His voice was oily with confidence, but his eyes flickered at the crowd's silence. He wasn't used to quiet resistance. Then Ruth stepped forward, and with calm hands, she unfolded the letter. But this is Mabel Bell's handwriting. Those of you who knew her will recognize it. This letter was written days before the fire that took her and little Elsie. It names Eli Granger of the Midline Railway as the man who threatened her family. It confirms the chimney was damaged, that the fire was an accident, and it proves Gideon Bell was blamed because it suited the interests of men like Harlan Voss. She let the words settle like dust. A woman near the back stood. My husband told me once that Gideon pulled him from a collapsed mine shaft, said he owed him his life. Never spoke of it again, but I remember the look in his eyes. A man near the front spoke next. Gideon fixed the schoolhouse roof without being asked. Didn't ask for payment either. Just did it. One by one, the testimonies emerged. Not loud or angry, but steady and undeniable. And with each voice, the lies Harlan had sown began to wither. He shifted uncomfortably, red rising in his cheeks. All hearsay. None of it legal. Ruth met his gaze. Truth doesn't need permission to exist. The church walls held their silence, but the air inside was no longer still. It buzzed with something stronger than anger. Conviction. Outside, the wind picked up, and in the hearts of those gathered, the storm began to turn. The judge's boots echoed sharply against the wooden floor as he stepped into the hushed church hall, the weight of authority following behind him like a shadow. He was not a man of warmth or patience, his jaw square, his eyes sharp, the long black coat dusted with road dirt. He held the reins of the room with a single glance, and even Harlan Voss stepped back, his smug expression faltering. I'm told there's been an accusation, the judge said, his voice steady and clipped, and a counterclaim. Ruth nodded, stepping forward with Mabel's letter held in careful hands. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying across the pews, what we have here is not just a dispute over land or guardianship. What we have is the truth, finally brought into the light. The judge raised a brow, but took the letter. He read in silence, lips moving faintly, brow furrowing deeper with each line. Then he turned to Harlan. You claimed this girl is your legal ward, he said. Harlan straightened, smoothing the front of his coat. That's correct. Clara's mother was my late wife. The girl's mine to look after, and she was taken. She's 19. The judge cut in. You've claimed she's 17 on legal forms. That's perjury. The color drained from Harlan's face. She's of age, and under the law, she may reside where she wishes. Furthermore, this letter clearly contradicts the story surrounding the fire that killed Mabel Bell and her daughter. It names Eli Granger and the railroad company as aggressors, and you, mister. Voss as a participant in their intimidation. Harlan's voice cracked. That's her handwriting. Could have forged it. The judge turned the letter over, already confirmed by 3 townspeople who knew her hand, including the preacher and your own sister-in-law, the silence in the church swelled until it broke with murmurs. Harlan's shoulders tensed, his fists clenched. The railroad men had already slipped away toward the door, leaving him standing alone. The judge turned to Clara. "Miss Voss, do you wish to remain with Mr. Bale?" Clara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremble beneath her ribs. "I do. He saved me. And not just from Harlan. He gave me a home, a life. No one else even tried." The judge nodded. "Then that's the end of that." He turned to the deputy. "Arrest Harlan Voss for filing fraudulent claims, attempted kidnapping, and perjury in a legal document. If Mr. Granger and his associates can be found, their charges will follow." The deputy hesitated for only a moment, then stepped forward and took Harlan by the arm. The older man protested, voice rising, but no one moved to defend him. The townspeople only watched, some in shock, some in quiet satisfaction, as he was led out, cursing under his breath, shoulders hunched under the weight of his own undoing. The judge looked out over the gathered crowd. This land belongs to Gideon Bell. It never stopped belonging to him, and unless I hear otherwise from a higher office, it stays that way. A hush followed. Then someone in the back began to clap, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Another joined in, then another, until the room echoed with applause that rolled like thunder through the church hall. Gideon stood still in the center of it all, his massive frame unmoving, his eyes unreadable. But Clara, standing beside him, saw what no one else did, the slight tremble in his hands, the way his jaw tightened, not with fear but with release. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for him. He was no longer a ghost in the woods. He was a man, cleared of guilt, restored in the eyes of the community that had cast him out. And this time, when the world looked at him, it saw the truth. The snow melted slowly, retreating in patches across the hillside like a long-held breath finally released. Where once the ground had been buried and silent, now it stirred. Wet earth, giving way to wildflowers, sap dripping from the trees, and the call of birds returning to familiar branches. Spring had arrived, and with it a kind of quiet resurrection. The cabin, once isolated and still, now pulsed with life. Hammering echoed across the clearing as townsfolk raised beams for the new barn, their laughter carrying over the hills. Children ran through the budding grass, chasing one another in wide loops, their shrieks of joy mixing with the low bleats of goats and the rustle of wind through pine. No longer a place of solitude, the cabin had become a hearth at the center of something growing. Gideon stood by the porch, sanding a length of pine with deliberate care. His hands moved slow, steady, shaping what would become a table for the new schoolroom. His shoulders were still wide, his voice still seldom used, but the hardness in his face had softened. When he looked up and saw Clara speaking with a group of children under the budding oak, his lips curved just slightly into something close to a smile. She wore her hair loose now, pinned back only enough to keep it from her eyes as she read aloud from a tattered book. The children sat in a semicircle, boots muddy, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. They were the forgotten ones, the orphaned, the half-wild, the ones shuffled between houses or left to wander the outskirts of town. Clara saw them because she had once been one of them, and now, with chalk and paper, stories and sketches, she gave them a kind of belonging they'd never known before. The school was little more than a single-room structure, its roof thatched and its walls made from hand-split boards. But inside it was warm and bright. The shelves were lined with borrowed books. Clara's drawings hung on the walls, and each child had a place carved just for them. Chairs and desks, handmade by Gideon himself, every piece shaped by the same hands that had once split logs in silence. The rescued fawn, now grown into a lean young doe, roamed freely near the edge of the yard. She grazed in the wild grass that had sprung up where snow once lay, unbothered by the noise of children or the creak of wagon wheels. Occasionally, she would approach the porch, nudge Gideon's hand for a scratch behind the ear, then dart off into the trees as if the forest itself were her playground. Some evenings after the work was done and the last child had gone home, Clara and Gideon sat side by side on the porch, watching the sun set over the ridge. They didn't always speak. They didn't need to. The cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a home, not just for them, but for anyone who needed a second chance. The past hadn't disappeared. Its ashes still lay buried beneath the pine tree on the hill. But now, above them, wild flowers bloomed. The evening settled slow and warm over the ridge, wrapping the cabin in a hush of golden light. The trees whispered with a soft breeze, and somewhere beyond the clearing, the stream babbled contentedly over smooth stones. The children had gone home hours ago, and the last of the tools had been put away. All that remained was the quiet, the kind that no longer felt empty, but full. Clara stepped out onto the porch, cradling something wrapped in linen. Gideon sat in his usual spot, whittling a strip of cedar, the curl of wood piling at his feet. When he looked up and saw her, he straightened, brushing shavings from his lap. "I made something," she said, a little breathless, a little unsure. "For you." He said nothing, just tilted his head slightly, those steady eyes of his soft with curiosity. She sat beside him and placed the bundle in his hands. Carefully, as if it might break, Gideon unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small book, hand-bound with twine and covered in stitched leather. His fingers hovered over the first page. "Go on," Clara urged, her voice low. "It's our story." He opened it slowly, and there, in charcoal and ink, were the images of the months they'd shared. The cave with its mouth dark against the snow. The first fire in the hearth. His hands, large and careful, tending the fawn's broken leg. Her sketchbook on the windowsill, pages fluttering in spring wind, the children laughing beneath the oak, the barn rising beam by beam. She had drawn it all, not just the things they had done, but the things they had become. There was strength in the lines of her strokes, but gentleness, too, and in the way she had captured his face, not with sharpness or legend, but with quiet dignity. He saw something he had almost forgotten he was capable of being. He turned another page. It was a sketch of her, sitting by the fire, reading aloud. The light from the flames caught in her hair, her eyes full of life and purpose. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "I never thought," he began, voice rough, "that anyone would see me like this." She blinked back tears, smiling through them. "Then you were never truly seen before." He set the book down on his knee, hands trembling. His breath caught in his chest. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, slowly, awkwardly, but with complete sincerity, he cleared his throat. "Clara," his voice cracked, "will you stay?" She tilted her head, eyes soft. "Not as a guest," he continued, "not as someone passing through. I mean, will you stay as my wife?" Her lips parted, but no words came at first. Her hand found his, wrapping around the fingers that had once only known solitude and survival. "There's no place else I belong," she whispered. The forest around them swayed with the evening wind. The last light of day painted the clearing in gold, and in the silence that followed, everything that once was broken began to knit itself whole. The river shimmered beneath the midday sun, its current slow and gentle, as though the world itself had quieted for the occasion. The clearing beside it, once overgrown and forgotten, had been swept clean and lined with wildflowers picked by children from the hills, violets, asters, and tiny white daisies woven into loose garlands. A long wooden bench, carried down from the schoolhouse, served as the altar. No bells rang, no music played, but the stillness was sacred. Clara stood barefoot on the soft grass, her dress simple, the hem stitched by hand in the evenings leading up to this day. Around her waist, tied with care, was a faded blue ribbon, her mother's, recovered from the bottom of an old trunk, smoothed flat, and carried like a blessing. Her hair was pinned back with sprigs of wild mint, and her smile, quiet and full, seemed to light the meadow from within. Gideon waited by the river, wearing his father's old coat, the fabric rough and patched at the elbows, but pressed and clean. His beard had been trimmed, though unevenly, and his boots shined with oil. He looked both enormous and boyish in the moment, his hands fidgeting at his sides, his eyes never leaving Clara's as she walked toward him. Midwife Ruth stood between them, her gray hair pinned beneath a bonnet, her hands folded gently at her waist. She had delivered half the town, buried the other half, and today she was joining two souls who had clawed their way back from the edges of grief. She spoke few words, simple, heartfelt ones, about home and healing, about how love, when built not on possession but on choice, could outlast any winter. Behind them, the townsfolk gathered in a wide half circle, men in worn coats, women in aprons, children squirming in their Sunday best. They had once whispered about Gideon in fear, once turned their backs on Clara without hesitation. But now they stood as witnesses not just to a marriage, but to a mending. The old preacher who had once muttered judgment now stepped forward with a bowed head and murmured a blessing. His voice cracked when he said Gideon's name, and when he looked up, there was apology in his eyes. Gideon gave a small nod in return. It was enough. Laughter drifted from the children as they raced along the bank, tossing pebbles into the water. Someone passed around fresh bread. A young girl played a fiddle off-key but sweet. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, and the river carried the sound of joy downstream like a hymn. When Ruth asked if they would take each other, Gideon's answer was low but certain. Clara's was spoken with tears on her cheeks and sunlight in her eyes. They kissed beneath the oak tree that leaned over the water, its branches dappled with blossoms. The past didn't vanish in that moment, but it settled quietly, peacefully, as though it had found a place to rest. And for the first time in years, Gideon didn't feel like a man standing apart from the world. He felt like a man who had found his place within it. The soil was rich and dark beneath Clara's fingers, warmed by the late spring sun, and sweet with the scent of new life. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, planting rows of peas beside the wooden stakes Gideon had carved. Around her, the garden hummed, with bees and the rustle of leaves, alive in a way it had never been before. Wild mint had crept in along the edge of the path, and she let it stay, liking the way it softened the borders. Behind her, the cabin stood sturdy and sunlit, its walls no longer worn by loneliness, but touched by laughter and life. The barn, rebuilt with the help of friends and neighbors, gleamed with new wood, and the schoolhouse door swung open to the warm breeze. It was a place no longer marked by sorrow, but by what had grown from it. On the porch, Gideon rocked gently in the chair he'd built himself, one boot tapping in rhythm as he held a small child nestled in his arms. The little one, a girl with a crown of curls and eyes the color of spring rain, slept soundly against his chest, her small fingers curled into the collar of his shirt. He looked out across the yard, watching Clara with the same quiet reverence he had shown the land for years. But now his eyes held something more. Peace. The fawn, now fully grown, grazed near the garden, her coat sleek and dappled with sunlight. She no longer limped. Sometimes she wandered off into the trees, but she always came back. Like Gideon, like Clara. Clara stood and brushed the soil from her hands. She turned to look at them, her husband, her daughter, the home they'd made not from wealth or ease, but from something harder and truer. Love carved through hardship, joy born of survival. The wind stirred the tall grass, and a hawk circled high overhead. its cry sharp against the soft murmur of the world below. In the distance, the town continued its slow hum of life, but up here, nestled in the folds of the mountain, time moved differently. This was a place built by hands that had once only known how to protect and endure. Now those same hands planted, held, taught, and gave. The land had not just been tamed, it had been redeemed, just as the hearts that lived upon it had. And in the end, it wasn't grand speeches or sweeping moments that marked their transformation, but the small, steady ones. A child's breath rising and falling on her father's chest. A garden growing where snow once fell. A porch creaking beneath the weight of love instead of grief. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay. Stay when they've been broken. Stay when the world says they don't belong. Stay and build something that no cruelty can tear down. Let this story remind us that the strongest homes are not made of wood or stone, but of forgiveness, resilience, and love freely given. If you believe in the power of healing, of found family, and of goodness rising from the ashes, then you're part of this story too, and maybe somewhere out there your garden is just beginning to grow.